From the very start of my time with Space Marine 2, I was taken aback by the sheer scale, atmosphere, and attention to detail that was being showcased. The pride and care emanating from just this snippet of the grimdark world that Saber Interactive has built is palpable, and something I believe will resonate with both newcomers to the franchise and longtime fans of Warhammer 40K. During my hands-on preview of Space Marine 2, I was given access to a couple of non-campaign PvE missions, as well as a campaign mission from around the halfway point of the story. The mission opened with Titus and his squad exiting their ship onto a landing pad with an Imperial Guard staging area just beyond. Through this section, I saw an exciting glimpse of life among the war-torn Imperium. Militarum units bowing and kneeling at the sight of Space Marines, a commander delivering a rousing speech from atop an enormous Baneblade tank, a commissar delivering punishment to soldiers found guilty of cowardice, troops burning mounds of Tyranid corpses with flamers, and so much more. This small section really drove home how much effort has gone into the game's world building, and immediately made me think that Space Marine 2 could very well be the most authentic Warhammer 40k game we've ever seen. And since I know so many have been curious, it's an experience that you can indeed play through with or without your helmet. In my last preview, I said that Space Marine 2 really makes you feel like a Space Marine, and it's a sentiment that has only been further reinforced. But so far, this is also the first game that really makes you feel like you're in Warhammer 40k. A large part of this is thanks to the game's combat. It definitely demands more of you than 2011 Space Marine, but it also retains the same feeling of brutal, grimdark action that made the original great. This makes for a more thinking Marines hack and slash game, which works incredibly well. However, and it may be because the mission I played was set at the midpoint of the campaign, I did initially feel somewhat overwhelmed by the variety of inputs, enemies, counters, abilities, and resources that made up my first Savage melee. But after learning the language of Space Marine 2's combat, the blend of ranged firepower and close quarters battle quickly became much more fluid and so satisfyingly brutal. Wide swings of a chainsword can cleave through compacted hordes of surrounding Tyranids, while parries, dodges, counters, and gun strikes add complexity and are vital if you want to emerge from each bloody maelstrom unscathed. Parryable attacks will flash with a blue circle, and nailing one of these can immediately kill a smaller enemy or interrupt a larger foe's combo and leave them open for attack. Unblockable attacks are denoted by a red circle and must be dodged with a quick backstep or full-on combat roll. Perfectly timed dodges or parries can open up enemies to a gun strike, which is a counter that delivers a devastating pistol shot at close range. Lighter enemy attacks won't give you the same warning, but after an hour or so of battle, I found myself able to instinctively react to those moves too. It was at this point when Space Marine 2's flow of combat began to almost remind me of Sekiro, albeit with a chainsword swinging superhuman from the far future rather than a katana wielding shinobi. Chaining together attacks, parries, and dodges will quickly leave enemies exposed and vulnerable to executions, killing blows that the Space Marine 2 team has obviously delighted in crafting. Each execution seemed more visceral and satisfying than the last, from tearing limbs off of Tyranid warriors to ripping apart the sealed power armor of the traitorous Thousand Sons. Executions are also vital to the flow of combat, as each one will refill a portion of your armor. Previously, in the original Space Marine, executions would heal you, but this time health is returned through the use of consumable stims that must be found throughout the level, forcing you to be more mindful of your resources even as you charge into the fray. There is also much more strategy to be found in Space Marine 2's combat. A horde of Tyranids with varying enemy types can offer both different challenges and opportunities. Do you strike at the smaller mobs to thin the horde and give you more room to maneuver, or do you weather their blows and focus on the larger warrior enemies with the goal of cutting their synaptic link and in turn taking down surrounding lesser Tyranids? There may also be ranged enemy types to consider, firing strangling thorns that can slow movement or apply poison, or even hovering zoanthropes buffing nearby creatures with a psychic link, requiring you to break from the immediate close quarters battle to close the distance or engage these Xenos with ranged firepower. While I only saw a portion of the combat that Space Marine 2 has to offer, the brutal ballet of battle only grew more varied and more satisfying across the demo. As I made my way deeper into the mission, more tools and weaponry became available, such as the jump pack, which allowed me to fire hails of bolts from up on high and dive back into combat with a devastating strike from above. During last year's Space Marine 2 preview, there were only Tyranids to fight. This time around though, Chaos has reared its ugly head and I was able to see the Thousand Suns Chaos Space Marines in action, leading to a lot of intense scenarios. One moment saw me enter a giant plaza where Thousand Suns and their summoned demons and cultists were engaged with the Termagants, Hormagaunts and warriors of the Tyranids. I believe an Astartes would call that a target-rich environment. Following that carnage, the campaign portion of my preview culminated in a boss fight with a Thousand Sun Sorcerer, which not only provided a completely different gameplay experience, but was also one heck of a visual spectacle. As he cast spells and traversed across the arena, I noticed horrific eyes emerging from the walls and ceiling of the room. Shortly after, the ground below him turned to liquid that rippled towards me and my squad. An absolutely perfect visual realization of Warhammer's warp magic. The battle was completely different to the rest of the demo I played, but these visual details, as well as the attacks and the overall design of my final foe, were another element that really drove home Space Marine 2's attention to detail and its drive to bring so many of the elements of Warhammer 40,000 to life. Finally, as a massive Warhammer fan, I couldn't help but nerd out and get excited about the visuals on display in Space Marine 2. Not only were there tons of little details in the characters, armor, weapons, NPCs and environments for Warhammer fans to pick apart, but everything looks bloody fantastic too. From the explosions of your bolt rounds and the streaks of gore as you cleave an enemy in two, to the massive skies filled with flying enemies and dank, swampy jungle environments, Space Marine 2 is shaping up to be a feast for the eyes, albeit a brutal one. It combines all of these elements to create a cohesive and authentic feeling grimdark world. After the campaign, I also got to experience a couple of Space Marine 2's co-op missions. The Operations mode takes place alongside the main story of Space Marine 2, but sees you play as your own customizable Astartes in a squad of 3. One of the missions, aptly named Decapitation, saw my squad springing a trap on a Tyranid hive tyrant, knowing that doing so would disable the Tyranid swarm that Lieutenant Titus was fighting in the same campaign mission I just completed. These replayable PvE missions being so tightly connected to the main story makes them feel much more impactful. The chatter between squads and commanders are mirrored in each mission, so you feel like you're part of the bigger picture, even when you're replaying them as different classes or taking them on with a more casual approach as you try out new weapons or difficulties. From what I played, the main objectives of these missions do remain largely the same through each playthrough, and each will generally take you about 30 minutes on the standard difficulty. Variety mostly comes from Space Marine 2's AI director, changing up the enemies as it responds to your class and playstyle, or even springing surprise ambushes. I was actually surprised by how varied the class system was, as each had access to a different arsenal of weapons, unique perks, abilities, and filled their own niche on the battlefield. The Tactical Marine is your bread and butter Astartes, and has access to the most ranged weapons as well as a chainsword and an Auspex scan ability that both reveals enemies and makes them more vulnerable to damage. The Assault class lacks any ranged weaponry beyond a pistol, but has access to the most powerful melee weapons, as well as a jump pack that allows them to take to the skies and assault groups of enemies or priority targets from above. The Vanguard, meanwhile, is lightly armoured and more suited for close quarters combat and focusing on single targets, with access to bolt carbines, a melter rifle, which in Space Marine 2 mostly functions like a superheated shotgun, and a grapnel launcher ability that allows them to propel themselves towards foes with a diving kick and engage with their giant dueling knives, which makes this class great for folks looking to get up close and personal with their enemies. Bulwarks are the tank class and forego a main ranged weapon in favour of a giant shield that they wield alongside pistols and powerful melee weapons. Their special ability is to deploy a chapter banner, restoring armour to all squad members nearby. This makes them perfect at clearing hordes, staying in the thick of the fight and soaking up enemy damage. Snipers are, you guessed it, equipped with a selection of long-ranged weapons such as the Bolt Sniper and Las Fusil. They're great at starting off fights with a couple of long-ranged headshots into elite enemies, and their Camo Cloak ability allows them to turn invisible for a period of time, which is useful for breaking contact, flanking, and picking off pesky ranged enemies. Lastly, the Heavy class wields the big guns, like the Heavy Bolter, Heavy Plasma Incinerator, or Multi-Melter. Their weapons are so heavy that they don't actually get access to a melee weapon. instead having to swing their guns into the jaws of foes or deliver brutal kicks to an enemy's body. They are, however, the best at clearing hordes from range and delivering heavy firepower, with their Iron Halo ability creating a barrier that can block incoming ranged damage, allowing you to keep your finger on the trigger. All of these classes are cosmetically customizable, although from my time with the game, I feel as though it takes a little too long to earn some basic customization options. For example, if you want to buy the color Caliban Green to swap your chapter to Dark Angels as I did, you first have to use your well-earned credits to buy the chapter icon, and only then can you obtain the color. However, the credits you use for hot new paint jobs are also required for purchasing class and weapon perks as you work to progress through their respective trees, making this currency even more precious. Obviously, this was a preview build, so numbers may be tweaked and there may be other methods to earn said credits in the final release, but it did cause some concern over how much grinding may be required to craft your Astartes to your taste. Overall, Space Marine 2 is shaping up to be a more than worthy successor to the 2011 fan favourite. Everything that made the original Space Marine great is still here, but as a more considered and evolved version of itself, all of which comes together to make Space Marine 2 feel like both a familiar old friend and an exciting new experience. Space Marine 2's release date of September 9th is now just a few weeks away. And while there are a few elements that we've yet to see, such as the PvP mode Eternal War, there are already a lot of reasons for gamers and Warhammer fans to be excited about Space Marine 2. As someone who has been a huge 40k fan for over half of his life, I have never been more excited about a Warhammer video game.